Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the British Royal Armouries taking a look at some of the sneaky silenced pistols in their extensive firearms reference collection. Now, today's video is going to be largely speculative. What I'm going to tell you is a story based on circumstantial evidence, but I think it's likely quite accurate. And I think that by explaining this, perhaps this will attract some other information, other examples of these guns that perhaps do have some specific provenance and together can really enlighten maybe what was actually going on here. So what I suspect is that these two pistols, these two Lugers with suppressors, are in fact tools from the very early British Special Operations Service called Section D. And they were put together for nefarious purpose in occupied Europe in the early years of World War II. Now, let's start with what was Section D. Well, it was an organization put together in 1938, April of 1938, specifically to run non-military operations on continental Europe. It was really sort of the typical action spy thriller movie stuff of they were going to run propaganda, sabotage, direct action missions, stuff that wasn't formal military. They set up an R&D center when they were formed in 38, and they developed, well, the British would call them devices, but things like fuses, explosives, bombs, quite possibly suppressed pistols. Now, this organization, Section D, was rolled into SOE when SOE was formed in the wake of the Dunkirk evacuation. So I believe it was July of 1940 that SOE is formed. Section D of SIS becomes part of it. Essentially, they're moving organizational things around between different ministries. Now, SOE would eventually develop its own clandestine suppressed pistols, most notably the Welrod. But the Welrod's not around until late 1943. So we know that British special covert operations guys are going to want silenced pistols. So what did they use for that before they have the Welrod? Well, I think they were using, among other things, these Lugers. So let's get to a few other details here. The Royal Armouries have 4 of these, and they are essentially identical in characteristics, and there's another museum in the UK that has another one of them. So there's a non-coincidental batch of these guns, and the Luger would be a really perfect sort of gun for early British special operations to use for covert action in Europe. Of course, it's a German pistol, it's going to fire German ammunition, and it's going to be unobtrusive. It's going to be unnoticed largely in Germany and German-occupied Europe. Like, of course there are Lugers. There are lots of Lugers around. Now, where did the British get these? Oh, also, by the way, it's very easy to thread the barrel of a Luger to attach a suppressor. You don't need any new parts. If you wanted to use what some might argue would be a much better pistol for the task, like a Colt 1903, well, you're going to have to get an extended barrel first so that you can thread it to put on a suppressor. That's perhaps a bit tricky in the middle of 1939 or 1940. It's a lot easier, like, let's do the job with something that's entirely on hand already, which leads me to the fact that these Lugers were on hand in, I think it was either 39 or 40. The British had essentially a pistol buyback. Like, we need guns for the national defense. Hand in your guns. People were compensated for them. These were purchased back by the government to use for all sorts of home guard sort of purposes. This is about the same time that there were drives being run in the United States to send a gun to defend the British home. And a lot of huge variety of firearms from the US were shipped over to England for use by Home Guard to free up the very valuable limited number of military arms for the frontline soldiers to use. At any rate, the Luger was a very popular pistol. I mean, the Luger comes out in 1900. It's around pre-World War I, actually during World War I. It's available for sale during the interwar years. Internationally, there are Lugers being imported into the United States during this time. Abercrombie will sell you a Luger that's marked Abercrombie and Fitch. And there were certainly plenty of Lugers available in England. It was a popular pistol. It was a good pistol. And so there were a fair number of Lugers that were purchased up by the British government in I think it was 1940. And all of a sudden, okay, we've got Lugers. These are unattributed. These really are sort of the best version of sneaky stealth pistols because they're just commercial purchase. There's really no way to track where they came from. They don't scream British agent. It's just a commercial Luger. They paired that with silencers that were made by Parker Hale, but not marked. So we'll pull the silencer apart in just a moment. But it's a British silencer, but it has no markings on it at all. And a silencer is something that really is difficult to track, especially in the pre-internet age. Like, it's a metal tube full of some baffles. Who made it? If it doesn't say on the side, it's going to be tricky to find out unless you have someone who's really expert in that specific subject. And interestingly, one thing that here argues against these being some random put together guns, the suppressors and the guns are actually all serial numbered to each other. So they took the serial number from the Luger and added it onto the suppressor. That is the only mark on that suppressor. So without further ado, let me show you one of these up close. All right, so here are both our pistols. Of the 4 in the armories here, I picked these 2 because I thought they made a decent pair, exemplifying the fact that they're both commercial guns. We've got one with a grip safety, one without. They're both DWM marked, which would be appropriate. We'll dig in a bit closer on this one. You see the serial number there is 6423, and that has been marked on the suppressor, 6423. And you can see that that stamping was actually done after the suppressor was blued. You can see how it's there's kind of a halo around each of the letters. That's the finish essentially being destroyed by the stamp impact. As I said, it is a Parker Hale suppressor, but not marked. Parker Hale was actually probably the most substantial suppressor maker in the UK prior to World War II. They did make them commercially during the 1920s and 30s. This has a little gold bead as a sight. Now, how useful that is as a sight is going to be, you know, a bit debatable because you don't have a front or rear, you just have that gold bead. But that's also going to be an indicator to let you know if the suppressor starts to unthread. And, you know, as long as it's, well, it's obviously it's repeatable because they have ground down the front sight here, specifically custom on each gun, matched with each suppressor. That's why the serial number is important, so that they all time up properly, so the bead is on top. That also ensures that you'll have a repeatable point of impact, because if you swapped suppressors around, you would be changing the deflection of the bullet. Anyway, these do each have muzzle protector nuts with them. Here's the one for this gun. That just is going to thread on there if you don't want to have the suppressor on it. We do, however, of course, want to have the suppressor on it. So that's the remains of the Luger front sight, used as essentially a measuring point to stop the suppressor. We can take this and remove the front cap, and we have a bunch of stamped baffles. We have, in fact, that many baffles. So they go all the way back to this rib, this ridge in the suppressor, and that is there because it locates that plate with a number of vent holes in it. So the front section here is an expansion chamber, then you have that ventilated base plate, and then you have your stack of individual stamped baffles, each with a couple of little vent ports in it. So that is very much characteristic of pre-World War II commercial suppressors. The Maxim silencers were very similar to this in construction. That's how it was done. So there you go. That is, I think, a pretty good example of authentic sabotage and resistance equipment provided by Great Britain circa 1940, 1941. So assuming that this sequence of events is true, and these are in fact pistols put together by Section D of what would later become Special Operations Executive, what were they doing with them? Well, who really knows? We don't know how many they put together. There are no formal records that have come to the surface detailing that these things were made, but this is an area where there may not be that many records. This is secret intelligence covert work. A lot of this stuff was very deliberately not documented. You didn't want the documentation to get out. You know, this was an agency that did in fact have a potential plot to assassinate Hitler, although it was, I think it was going to be a guy in German uniform with a Mauser rifle, not a parachuted in agent with a silenced Luger. But that's exactly the sort of thing that they would have jumped at the opportunity to do if they thought it was feasible. These are the days a bit before like the sort of professional spycraft that we think about today. It was much more, you know, young gentlemen of aristocratic families doing their part in, you know, social graces were as much a part of intelligence work as field action. In a way, this is the world that James Bond comes from, and there are many things that we think of today as like not juvenile, but sort of amateurish and over the top, and you wouldn't like, come on, you're not going to parachute a guy into Berlin to shoot Hitler. Well, that sort of thing was actually done. You look at the origins of SOE and also of like the OSS, and you see a lot of that sort of thing. Amateurs who didn't have a lot of good background information to know from prior generations what does make good successful spycraft and what is hopelessly doomed to failure. And the result was all sorts of colorful operations throughout World War II. So I think a batch of civilian repurchase, clandestine, unmarked silencer, suppressed Lugers to wreak some havoc in occupied Europe really does make perfect sense. And it's extremely cool to have examples of them here to actually handle and take a look at. So big thanks to the Royal Armouries for giving me access to these, for helping me with some of the background information on them. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.